Tonight's program, billed as a conversation, will follow a question and answer format, so I decided to follow suit in my introduction to our two conversers, Jill Lepore, David Woods Kemper, 41, Professor of American History at Harvard, and James David Moran, Vice President for Programs and Outreach here at AAS. So my first question is, how many of you here tonight were born in Worcester or have lived in West Boylston or Sterling? Raise your hand. Jill, welcome back to your homeland. Which of you has attended the same universities where Jill has studied or taught? Tufts, Michigan, Yale, UC Berkeley, UC San Diego, BU, or Harvard? Again, you're in good company. And wouldn't you, like me, love to sit in on the class that she teaches at Harvard called The Democracy Project? Listen to the course description. A fast-paced and sweeping introduction to American political history, from past to present, structured around one of the most important democratic institutions, debate. Class debates wrestle with questions like citizenship, rights, and race, using readings from primary documents chronicling pivotal struggles over ongoing issues. No formal debating experience required or expected. I want to sign up for that class. Look at you. How many of you are regular readers of The New Yorker, where Jill has been a regular contributor since 2005, contributing essays to an astonishing array of topics, historical, political, and otherwise? Those of you who had the pleasure of reading her there applauded, I'm sure, when she was named a 2019 finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Criticism, the second time she has been so honored for her writings. New Yorker followers? There's a big crowd. And finally, I'm sure that many of you have enjoyed her prize-winning books, most of which relate to pre-20th century American history and are therefore to be found on the shelves here at AAS. And we pulled some of them if you're not familiar with them all. We don't have her secret history of Wonder Woman. Maybe we should change our collecting scope just so we can have that too. We at AAS are proud of the contributions we have made to her scholarship, beginning with a Peterson Fellowship we awarded her in 1993 to support work on her dissertation on King Philip's War, which was the basis of her first book, The Name of War, awarded the prestigious Bancroft Prize in 1999. I know that Jill will be talking tonight about her most recent book, These Truths, which we have here for sale, but I'm also eager to read her forthcoming volume entitled This America, described as a manifesto for a better nation and a call to a new Americanism which reclaims the nation's future by reclaiming its past. Jill's interrogator tonight, Jim Moran, is no stranger to those of you who have attended our public programs, as he is usually the one who introduces our speakers. Since coming to the Antiquarian Society in 1994, Jim has worn many hats, often simultaneously. With a background as a writer, director, producer, publicist, and educator, Jim's first AAS project was The History Show, recorded before a live audience at Mechanics Hall and heard in 151 public radio stations in 47 states. Do any of you remember it? Yeah, a few. He is also the writer behind Isaiah Thomas' Patriot Printer, the one-man play which is performed annually before fifth graders throughout the Worcester school system and now being fashioned into a web-delivered resource. Jim has also served as the guiding hand over the years for the Society's many partnerships with K-12 educators and has helped us welcome artists and creative writers of every sort as research fellows, who each in turn has enriched the research community that flourishes here. Jim is currently the producer for our open house on Saturday, where he will be stage managing short talks by 25 different speakers who will be presenting throughout the day, each on a favorite item from the AAS collection. As I said, he's a man of many talents, and I know he's relieved at tonight's assignment, a one-on-one with a brilliant and fascinating historian and writer, Jill Lepore. Please welcome.
Thank you. So I'd like to get us started, Jill, by asking you, and I'm going to entertain a couple of questions with Jill, and then we will open up to questions from the audience as well. But I'd like to start by asking you, what got you started, what got you intrigued by history?
Well, first, thanks, Ellen, for the lovely introduction, and thanks, everyone, for coming out on this evening, skipping the Red Sox, which don't deserve your viewing time in any case. It's lovely to be here. This is a room where historians work with documents, and so I look at you all, and I kind of sort of feel like I'm rifling through your pages. It's a funny thing to see faces in a place where you're used to looking at pages. This is a library, most actively, and this is where the real research happens. It is a scandal of my career that I confess all the time so that I don't get outed for something that I'm happy to admit. I have no degrees in history. I teach in a history department. I am a historian, but I somehow never managed to officially study history. And I think part of the reason for that is that a lot of what we maybe think about when we think about the study of the past is actually somewhat boring to me. I'm not actually super interested in the March of the Monarchs or the Parade of the Presidents or the history of battles and warfare. So a lot of what engages the public or is expected to engage the public, or a lot of what I know that with my own kids I explore as a form of kind of heritage tourism, so sometimes when people say history, that's what they mean. And by history, I really mean the study of the relationship between the past and the present. I sort of sometimes think of that history as alchemy, and the kind of history I'm interested in is chemistry. Which is to say, I'm interested in the form of inquiry, the empirical form of inquiry about the nature of the past and the paths that lead to the world that we inhabit now. And I mean that even in the smallest personal sense. I did something really fun today, which is I spoke at my old high school. So shout out to Wachusett Regional High School. All right. And this student reporter came up to me for this school newspaper to ask me the same question you've just asked me. I'm sorry, I'm such a pedant. My answers will be 15 minutes each.
Great.
So student reporter asked me how I came to be interested in high school, and I told her the story that in history, and how I actually am interested in history, which is that when I was in 10th grade, I grew up in West Boylston, and then we moved, and I went to Wachusett for 10th grade, and I didn't know anybody. And I had this 10th grade English teacher, who I am still in very close touch with, Tom Moore. And at the end of the year of 10th grade honors English, he did this thing which no one had ever heard of at the time. He had come from Berkeley. He was just a different sort of person. Yeah. But it's actually a very common school assignment now. But he asked us all to write a letter to ourselves in the future. And he was going to mail them to us when we were freshmen in college, if we were in college. And I was an extremely earnest and serious 14-year-old. And I took this really seriously. And I imagined myself at 18 as a freshman, and I had something really important to say to myself, which I said in no uncertain terms. It was like the meanest letter anyone has ever written to anybody. Because nothing beats the self-hatred of a 14-year-old. Like, imagine how much you hate yourself. So I wrote this terribly mean letter. It was like, you're just a loser. You never do anything that you really care about. You're always pretending to be somebody that you're not. And it was like imagine the letter you'd write at 14. So I was a freshman in college, and I got a letter that I thought was from my mother, because he had sent it to our parents' house, and then she had forwarded it to me, and I was like, oh, great, a letter from my mother. And I opened it up, and it was an envelope from me, and it was this letter from me, and it was this terrifying, angry screed. And it completely jolted me and changed the course of my life, because I changed my major, I stopped playing field hockey, I dropped out of ROTC, and I was like, I think I'm supposed to major in English, because this 14-year-old really thought I would be a writer by now. And so it changed the course of my life, but in a deeper way. I loved reading old mail. And I would say that most of what historians do, especially historians who work at this institution, whose focus is on pre-1876, so what really you're talking about is mail. And other people's letters are really super interesting. And I was kind of fascinated that this was both me and totally not me. Like, I didn't remember writing the letter. I had no recollection, like, I have a terrible memory. So it actually illustrated to me that there is something kind of powerful about what the past can communicate to the present. I mean, I didn't, become a history major. Because I would go to history courses and I would be like, I'm not interested in this. I'm interested in the relationship between the past and the present and how people navigate that. Even down to the level of, whose turn is it to do the dishes tonight? Well, I didn't last night, you didn't the night before. That's what I mean by the past. I actually think, what we carry around about how we got stuck where we are and how to fix it, even in, these daily interactions, is what I mean by the past. And I've always, ever since I was a kid, I was interested in that.
What do you think that history can teach us beyond what happened in the past, the facts and the events of the past?
Yeah.
Are there things?
And I don't mean to say the facts and the events are not important. It's a body of knowledge that's really useful.
Right.
I think in an immediate sense it's useful. But in a deeper, I think, moral sense, mostly the study of the past teaches humility. It's actually very hard to think that, our problems are so dire or our way of thinking about problems is so unimpeachable when you study the past. I often find comfort in how familiar are most of the things that we think are intractable and unprecedented. They're actually all precedented. And I find that helpful. I find it, in a weird way, it's not the comfort of nostalgia. It's, in fact, the comfort of distress. There's something comforting in knowing that this kind of, say, the political unease and distress that I think people often think is just an entire novelty is not. I find that, I guess I personally find that helpful. I also think it's funny that so many of our polarized political battles are in fact about things like monuments or naming, that they appear to be over the past, which are kind of, a lot of it is about the performance of piety. Whereas I don't actually think there's much piety left when you study the past. It's hard to be pious about the gritty misery of the human condition.
Do you...
ask me a question that won't end so gloomily.
Okay, I'll try
just don't ask me about the Red Sox.
One of the things to me that's always struck me about the discipline is that it is one of the unique ways in which we can extend our own consciousness beyond our own existence. It forces us to kind of think beyond our own lifetime. And it also, at times, I think, because the past is so different, and you brought this out so brilliantly in your work, that often people think very differently about the world in the past. It has the capacity, I think, sometimes to potentially teach us about tolerance. Because it's a way for us to think about people who are so different from us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing that we tend to lose sight of about the past is the specificity of a historical sensibility. So if you watch period drama, of which there is a huge abundance, I mean, mainly it's on HBO, but there's a lot of period drama, and it can be really fun to watch. And there was an era, like when I was in graduate school, do you remember all those Merchant and Ivory productions? They're all like adaptations of Jane Austen, the endless Merchant and Ivory, as well as the sort of like Downton Abbey-ness of it all. And historians would always say, like, they get the buttons exactly right. Do you know what I mean? Like, exactly the material that the buttons would have been crafted out of on the waistcoat. And they'll hire an artisan to reproduce, something. And then the sensibility is completely wrong. For instance, the thing that I tend to notice a lot, because at the time I was studying the history of privacy, and it's a long-standing interest of mine. Privacy is a historical notion. It's not a part of the human condition. There's, I think, a universal experience of certain kind of bodily shame that we would associate with the kind of the parable in the Garden of Eden. But privacy, as we think about it, it involves a specific set of historical developments. And so I would always watch these period dramas that would be like 18th century. The 18th century notion of privacy, I'm sorry, is completely unfamiliar to our notion of privacy. And I love that about studying the past. I find it fascinating that sensibilities can be so different. Like, I take for granted, like, well, I think that we should put children in separate bedrooms. That seems like a reasonable thing to me. Or maybe 2 children per bedroom, or like as if that's just a natural thing, like you would want that. That's a sort of specific development of Victorianism and then later of the building industry. Like, it's not, it's not because, it has to do with a sort of set of ideas about the desexualizing of child. It's a long story. Yeah. I love those kind of long stories. But I think when I say, like, when I draw my silly distinction between alchemy and chemistry, what I think, I don't think we learn a lot by way of really imagining other people's experiences and strengthening our capacity for empathy, is by studying the lives of famous people with huge amounts of power, right? And that, like, I find presidential biography often very fascinating. I often have to write about presidents, and I write about them biographically, say, but that genre emerges from a culture of veneration and not of the exercise of sympathy, right? So that's why it looks like alchemy to me. It's like, I can't actually judge how I would have decided about, whether I would have dropped a bomb in Hiroshima. I didn't get the briefing. Like that. It's fascinating, but it's not. It isn't about me reckoning with how other human beings work and whereas the lives of ordinary people, which is what I tend to want most to write about, and what is historically in the 18th century, history diverged from an emerging form of essentially historical writing, which is the novel. The novel is essentially invented in the 18th century as the anti-history, because history would be about men, especially men who had a lot of power and who left voluminous written records. And the novels are mainly about private lives and about women, and they're ordinary people, but they made equal claims to truth. I mean, there's a whole kind of claim to the universality of the truth of fiction that the particularity of the truth of history can never contemplate. And I think that division between history and fiction left a huge problem in its wake, that my generation of historians who were trained by social historians, a couple of whom are in this room, some very distinguished social historians, who were trying to rectify that by saying, well, let's actually use empirical methods of historical investigation to study the lives of ordinary people. Because that actually is really worth, if you do that, then, especially if you can get inside the heads and the experiences of ordinary people in different times and different places, then you are strengthening and challenging your capacity to understand other people, not your leaders.
You're a very prolific writer and a wonderful writer, if I may say so. What do you see are the elements of effective historical writing?
I think the elements of effective historical writing are the same as the elements of any strong writing, with the caveat that your obligation to evidence is different than in other forms of. There's specific rules of evidence and standards of evidence. I have a kind of a long list of like do not do's that I give to my students all the time. I think it's quite important because when you're writing history, you really are writing about people, and you owe it to them to get their lives right. The same way a reporter has an obligation to someone that you've interviewed. And I often work as a reporter. I mean, not always, but I often do work as a reporter, and I find the difference between the two really interesting. But if you go interview someone and they say something really self-impeaching, and they did it unintentionally, and in the context of, kind of a betrayal of themselves, there's a real burden of there's a real obligation on you to assess whether or not that's something you could or should use. And the same applies in historical writing. I think we just don't talk as squarely about the ethics of that, because the dead don't come back and sue you, right? So, or they don't tweet about you or whatever. I don't know what happens to reporters these days. But I feel personally accountable to the people that I'm writing about, to the places that I'm writing about. I won't write about a place unless I've been there. Like I need to go visit it. Obviously, it's changed since it's a really important thing to do. There are a lot of rules about fairness of evidence. But in terms of how do you write well, it's about history. Well, you think about what's interesting. You figure out how to engage your reader in that interesting material. And if you're going to engage in that interesting material, where does that happen? I mean, I have two things that I can say specifically about writing New Yorker essays, which is what people are often asking about. One is, when you write a scholarly journal article, what you're supposed to do is say, I am so smart, I found this amazing thing, and it changes what all you other scholars always thought, and you were wrong, and I am right, and here's how I know that, and here's my evidence, and I'm so smart, and did I tell you again? I found this out. Like, that's what a scholarly journal article is, and it's unbearable to read. Like, it's a piece of prose. You're just like, it's just impossible. Like, who wants to read this? Like, just tell me what you know. I don't actually want to know how great you are, how revolutionary this is. Like, I can figure that out. But if you're writing in a magazine, in a general interest magazine like the New Yorker, the last thing you want to do is wear your erudition. Like, you want to almost hide your erudition. You want to disguise the original scholarly contribution that you're making, because your whole object is to delight your reader, to entrance and delight and inform your reader. So when I work on a New Yorker essay, I always have some debate among historians that I'm engaging in, or scholars, or literary scholars, or legal scholars, or whatever I'm working on, that I think the person who's an expert in this field reading this essay can sort of figure out, can see that. But nobody else cares. Who else cares if I'm challenging, Professor Smuts and, Dr. Schmo? Like, nobody cares. So you can't really be in there.
Yeah.
So I have to think about, I want to make an argument, but I'm writing for a magazine whose form is narrative. So I need to tell a story. And then the way narrative nonfiction works is the story itself has to make the argument. You don't say, in this essay, I will argue that. Right? Like, no one's going to read that in a magazine. So you have to say, I have a really great story. I'm going to tell you about this thing. And then, like, you can't wait to hear about it. And so it's sort of like a braided loaf, where here's the cool story, and then I'm going to sneak in a little bit of argumentation. And then we get to another plot point, and there's building suspense. I got some more complicated ideas I'm braiding in right here. Then we're like on the edge of, I just need to know how's this going to resolve. Here's my really big deal argument, okay? Quiet down. Here's the end. Like you have to, because no one wants to get to the end of the bottom of the argument.
Yeah.
So you have to parse that out. People just want to get to the end of the story. So it's an architectural thing. And then the other thing that I say about good writing, just because I read this once when I was reading about the history of the New Yorker, because when I started writing for the New Yorker, I was like, what am I supposed to do? I have no idea. And mainly I just did whatever my editor told me to do, but I was also trying to figure out, why is he telling me what he's telling me? And I remember reading somewhere that the New Yorker used to tell all of its writers that everything they wrote had to pass the strap hanger test. Have you ever heard of this?
No.
Okay, so this is New York, right? So imagine you're on the subway in New York.
Oh.
Okay. You're holding onto the strap because the train's rocking all over the place. And, like, it's crowded. And, like, the people are really right next to you, all around you. And you have your New Yorker. Can I have this piece of paper? So you have your magazine. Okay. And you get to the end of the page. So the strap hanger test is the distance between every word and every other word has to be close enough and tight enough and tense enough and fraught enough that you would risk letting go to turn the page. And that's the test, right? So thank you. So I think about that all the time when I'm writing, because I've gotten to a boring bit where I have to explain, I don't know, like I wrote I think maybe the last New Yorker article I wrote was about Eugene Debs. And I like Debs, and I think he's interesting, but it's a little hard to make him super fascinating when you also have to explain the relationship between social democracy and industrial unionism.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh no, I can't get that to pass. But like that, I think about that test all the time. Because the idea really is that you should be gripped.
Yeah.
And and you should be because you've paid a lot of money for the magazine, and you bought it because it's supposed to be gripping.
Yeah, yeah. And do you think about that strap hanger test when you're thinking about longer forms of work?
Yeah, I do. It's harder to pass it in longer form stuff, I think. The last few books I've written, I've done the audio recording for the whatever the recorded books edition, because I really like doing it, and it's fun, and I don't know, I just think it's fun. But I often have, by the time you go to do that, the book has been printed. I mean, it's not been released yet, but the pages are final. And so it's a terrible experience because, so how that works, I'm sorry, I'm going to stand up again. So you have like a music stand in a recording studio, and you're reading your own book. And you're like, I don't even want to turn the page. Like, you know what I mean? It's like, and I just like desperately want to take out a pencil and if I just cut 8 words from this paragraph, we'd be okay. But it's too late. Yeah. So it's actually really upsetting. Because, I always say, as writing advice, I say to my students all the time, like, your essay, you think it's kind of weak, you don't know, like, is it baggy? Have I missed it? Did I skip a big point? Read it out loud to your roommate, and you'll know, because your roommate's so bored, or your roommate's like, I don't even know what you were trying to say. Like, that's the best thing is to read it out loud, but then you can't really do that with a book. It takes too long. Like, I read These Truths was like 67 hours of recording, so I wasn't going to do that first, before I turned it in. Like, it's too much. But you can do that with an essay.
What made you want to write These Truths? What was the impetus for that?
Like a bunch of different things, but one was I wish I had such a book to give my students. Not to necessarily assign in class, but like a student from another country who comes to me and says, like, I don't have time to take a history class, but I'd love to know a little bit about American history. There isn't actually, like, what am I going to give them? Like Howard Zinn? No. So what, sorry. I'm sorry. Like Howard Zinn was a lovely, like an incredible, he was a hero. He was a hero of mine. But the book I wouldn't give to a student. So, I kind of just wish there was such a thing, like a kind of cheap paperback edition of a single volume history. But also, I had an experience in 2000 so remember Barack Obama was inaugurated in January of 2009. And the next day, Glenn Beck started that Fox News show that, I don't know what Beck's show was called. And then by February, there was the call for a new Tea Party to defeat what Obama had run on, which was what became the Affordable Care Act. And I had an assignment from the New Yorker to report on the Boston Tea Party, which I actually pitched because I just thought it was so cool there was a Tea Party in Boston. So I went and spent a lot of time with these people who were in the Boston chapter of this emerging grassroots national movement, the Tea Party movement. And they met at the Green Dragon Tavern, which is where the Sons of Liberty met. So it was really cool. And they were lovely. And I had a lot of fun getting to know them, and I learned a lot about what their political commitments were. It was really, really interesting. But I happened to be also teaching a seminar on Boston and the American Revolution. So, like, by day, I would be teaching this seminar, and then I would get on my bike at night, and I would go to Boston and hang out with these people from the Tea Party. And they really felt like they were, they took very seriously that they were a new Tea Party, and they really, they were really into Sam Adams, and they had all, and there was such a big disconnect between what I think the Revolution was about, what the body of historical scholarship on the Revolution, say, the last, 30 years has been. And what people who were involved in the Tea Party movement thought the Revolution was about, which is totally understandable. I mean, they're not studying history, and I'm teaching history. But it was different in particular ways that I found really troubling. Like I remember talking to one woman at a rally. We were standing in front of that cool, the Sam Adams statue right in front of Quincy Market and Faneuil Hall, and it was a rally, and I was talking to a woman who I think she was from Worcester. She was a nurse, and she was a lovely person. And she had this poster that was like party like it's 1773 or whatever. And we were talking, and she said, I just really wished I'd lived back then. And I said, as a nurse, you really wish that? And she said, I do. And I said, because you have died in infancy, or if you survived infancy, you'd have died in childhood, and if you survived childhood, you'd have died in childbirth. So there's just no part of as a woman that, like, I just was like, I don't, like, and I sort of kind of put that to her, like these, and also you're completely disenfranchised. Like, there's no capacity, that you can barely have the right to petition. You are legally the property of your husband. You can't divorce, if your husband leaves you and takes the children, you can never see them again. Like, think about the conditions of the political hierarchy that you're idealizing. Like, God bless Sam Adams, but I just didn't get it. Like, I don't get that. Yeah. Like, as a social historian, like, I don't get the veneration of that moment, because it's not, you can't pick and choose. Like, I wish that we had a weaker federal government, but I don't mind if I die of malaria. Like, you can't pick those things. Like, those things actually all belong together. Yeah. Like, there is no infrastructure, because when people, and there are no hospitals, because when people get sick, they just die. Like, health insurance, they didn't have health care. And I found that really, I just thought, like, what have we done? What has the body of the historical profession done that this could be how people understand the 18th century? It really made me feel like we had failed as a profession to bring any of the work, the incredible social history of the last 50 years to a public. It really made me sad. I mean, some people in the academy, like, I go to department pieces, why are you writing about Tea Party? Those people don't, because these are lovely people who are struggling with the political arrangements that they disagree with, and they're finding a model in history, and I feel like that's our fault. So it did sort of sat with me a lot. And when I was asked again, because I had been asked numbers of times to write a textbook, I said, what I do want to do is write a book for the public.
Did you change this nurse's attitudes or thinking in your conversation?
No, and I wasn't arguing with her. I was a reporter. Yeah. It's not my job. Like, I had to, like, take off that hat. Like, I'm not there with my cap and gown. I'm there with my pencil and my notebook. Yeah. So I was just inquiring, and I was like, that's so fascinating, because like, wouldn't it have been hard to live that? Like,
I'm a great fan of These Truths. I think it's a wonderful book, and I think it's a necessary book at this particular time. I was particularly intrigued by your sharing with your reader the whole notion of evidence, and to a degree how historians work. And I just would like to know more about your thinking about that approach, and can you talk more about evidence as...
Yeah, that was deliberate. I mean, it's a big commitment of the book to sort of explain, which was a tricky thing to do, right? Because there's a lot of kind of stuff that happens that needs to be covered, but to also kind of wrestle with how do we know that. Yeah. Partly that emerged out of my sense of the importance of the American experiment, which is actually an experiment. Like, the framing of the Constitution was understood by its framers as an experiment in the science of politics. They studied a lot of other forms of government. They considered that a laboratory, a body of evidence to review, and on the basis of that study, they came up with this frame of government as an experiment, and they wanted to see what would happen. And the book, it kind of raises the question that Alexander Hamilton raises in the first Federalist, in Federalist Number 1 in 1787, it has fallen to the American people to decide the question whether a body public can devise a frame of government in which they will be ruled by reason and choice rather than accident and force. And so we should try this, because every other government in the history of the world has been toppled by tyranny, or ruined by violence, or undermined by demagogues. And if you study all those destructions of every other form of government, well, we came up with this one that has these checks and balances and these separations of powers, and it's like we built like a clock, and it's a machine, and they talked about it that way. They were like engineering this thing, and so the idea was we're all engaged in this experiment. Like, we are not the mice. We're the scientists. So if we're all engaged in this experiment, and we're always supposed to be tinkering with our system of government and making sure that it's still working. And that is why in the United States, that is why we study American history. Because how can you engage responsibly as a citizen if you don't even understand why do we even have this system of government? And that, that's why there was civics education for so long and what that tradition of civics education is. And those things fell apart for kind of complicated reasons, but doing that work requires understanding the rules of evidence. Like, well, how are we supposed to tell if it's working or not working? Well, we have to have some rules of evidence. And so how do historians know things, and how do they... if you think about the whole democratic project as essentially a kind of scientific experiment, then you have to have a shared understanding of evidence. So a lot of this course comes from our contemporary epistemological crisis, where we know a lot about what we don't know, but we don't really know how to know. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but it's actually something my whole body of historical scholarship has really been about evidence. I also teach at the Harvard Law School, and I teach a class on the history of evidence that traces the history of evidence across realms from the 13th century to the present. So it's something I think about a lot, because I think we need to have a language with which we talk about evidence, so that when we disagree on evidentiary grounds, we can disagree on evidentiary grounds, and then we can look at the evidence together, instead of always disagreeing on ideological grounds.
At this point, I'd like to open this up to the audience to engage in questions. And I think what I'll do is I will bring this microphone over here and ask that if you have a question or a comment, that you come to the microphone. We are recording this for broadcast podcast on our website. And so we want to ensure that your comments and questions are part of that. So I'll just ask that you step to the.
And if you're way over there and you really want to ask a question, I can call on you and I can just repeat what you've said to the rest of the room. So don't feel disenfranchised over here.
So, Jill, do you have an example of when you started a project, you had kind of a sense of where you were going, but then the evidence made you change your mind or reinterpret anything?
Yes, that happens all the time. What is an example of that? Trying to think of something recent. Okay, well, this actually is a fairly recent New Yorker piece. I'm going to stand up because I find chairs uncomfortable. I'm not just...
That's quite all right.
Also, I can't see any of you people when I'm sitting down. I had an assignment last year to write a critic's piece, a kind of book review of a new biography of Ruth Bader Ginsburg that came out. And there was also there's that recent documentary, RBG, that people may have seen. And then more recently, this wasn't out yet, but I had the screenplay of it, a feature film called On the Basis of Sex. And I had my own ideas about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, just as someone who reads Supreme Court decisions and follows the whole kind of feminist kind of celebration of her kind of had fascinated me, and I'd seen the documentary. And I read the biography, which was itself a surprising biography, and brought me up short, and not because what was in the biography, but because the biography existed. Because until very recent history, no one would ever think to write a biography of a sitting Supreme Court justice. It would be considered interfering with the actual actions of the Supreme Court. One of the ways in which the Supreme Court works as a branch of government is that it is supposed to be entirely insulated from public opinion. I mean, we all have views about Supreme Court decisions, but they're supposed to make those decisions together and not in light of a constituency. But they're not supposed to be pleasing us with their decisions. That's what the Congress is supposed to do. Congress has the unhappy position of trying to please people. Supreme Court's actually not supposed to be pleasing people. If it were, it would be an elected body. Right? No one wanted to elect the justices. And so people were incredibly private about their lives as justices because they didn't want to be the objects of public attention, because then they might be the objects of public solicitation. So it's only in the last 20 years that anybody has even written biographies of sitting Supreme Court justices. And at first it was a really controversial thing to do. But there are also rules of biography that involve having the person's papers. Because if you're writing a biography of someone who has papers, that is an archive of their body of you are independent from them. A problem with biography is being overly influenced by your subject. And so, an authorized biography, remember the Kitty Kelly, the unauthorized biography? An authorized biography means basically you made a contract with your subject that they would get to read the book before you published it, and they could make you change it. That no legitimate biographer writes an authorized biography because you have no intellectual independence from your subject. But having someone's papers frees you from even needing to ask for their permission, as long as you have copyright permission. But Bader Ginsburg hadn't given her papers anywhere. So I found the biography really puzzling because it was a lot of interviewing, including interviewing with all of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's family. It's just I think it was a complicated book. It was a hard book for this, incredibly talented scholar to write. It had taken her 15 years, and I think that many people thought that Ginsburg was going to resign at the end of Obama's second term, or midway through his term, to be assured that the seat would go to an Obama appointee. In fact, many people strongly argued that it was a grave error that she did not resign then, and many people still do. So I think the biographer may have thought she would have resigned and then her papers would be open. Justices don't open their papers often for 50 years after their death, but they certainly don't open them while they're still on the court, because of these scruples. So I was just puzzled by the whole thing. I think the biographer maybe, I don't know the biographer. It was a fascinating book, but there was a part of the story, I'm told this long answers. There was a part of the story that really surprised me that I did not know. Because the story about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I happened to be working on this while the Brett Kavanaugh hearings were going on. Or the first one had happened, but the second one, the allegations against him hadn't come out. So I was really struck in the Kavanaugh hearings, at how entirely we have forgotten that the people don't get a say who's on the Supreme Court. The effort to, by public interest groups to fight against the Gorsuch nomination or fight against the Kavanaugh nomination or raise money to either favor or oppose the Kavanaugh, that as if these things have become almost like elected positions, which is a real degradation of the Constitution. So I was fascinated by that, but so I was like, well, at least it was good in Ruth Bader Ginsburg's day, I told myself, because Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I think it's 1993, when she was nominated by Bill Clinton, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, that was the famously uncontroversial nomination. That she was 97 in favor in the Senate and 3 abstentions or something like that. She was just so great and she was so perfect and she was so non-polarizing. But there was a funny paragraph in the biography that mentioned something about a letter that had been sent to Bernard Nussbaum, who was in the Justice Department, by Now's Legal Defense Fund opposing Ginsburg. And I was like, what the hell is that? What would Now oppose? It was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She's the feminist icon. And I went to the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe to try to find that letter. And because I went to I wrote to the Clinton Library, and they're like, we can't show you that letter. And I was like, this is the kind of thing that, as an archive rat, you're like, if you can't show me the letter, I'm going to find someone else who can. You just don't tell me you can't show me, because then I know it's important. So I went on this whole kind of weird hunt to try to figure out, were women's groups really opposed to Ruth Bader Ginsburg? And they were. And I did a bunch of research, and I wrote a story about why feminist organizations opposed Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her nomination, and then why we have forgotten that. So that was an example of, I thought I was going to write some sort of straightforward critics piece about this biography, which I thought was a good biography, given the circumstances of the limited evidence. But then I was like, no, I now have to write a kind of reported piece about this issue. And so the story became, it's a piece called Misjudged. That was complicated to write in many ways. I really kind of hate the trivialization of intellectuals. I did find the letter. well, an archivist, to be fair, an archivist at the Schlesinger Library managed to find it, and found the meeting minutes of the Now meeting where it was discussed. What it was, for those who are curious, so Clinton had to nominate a woman because remember all the women he tried to appoint that were struck down, like Kimba Wood and Zoe Baird and all the women with the nanny problems and Lanny Grenier, and he just could not get a woman named to any position to save his life. And it was this was following the Anita Hill stuff, right before he had come into office, in the Clarence Thomas. So he was determined, and Biden, who was still chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, they were just like, please give us a woman. But the feminist organizations kept sending lists of women to Clinton, and Bader Ginsburg was never on there. And he had thought she would be, and he would ask people, and they would, all the women are against her. She had given a lecture at NYU called the Madison Lecture, an endowed lecture, and she gave this lecture in which she said that she disagreed with the way Roe v. Wade in 1973 had been argued. And she was a staunch advocate for and a real defender of equal rights for women, including reproductive rights, but she thought reproductive rights should have been gone to the Supreme Court in a case that she had in fact brought to the Supreme Court, but that had never actually been heard, in which a woman had been forced to have an abortion by the Air Force. She thought that was an equal rights issue instead of a privacy case, and that would be a better precedent-setting case if the right to choose was about wanting to choose to have a baby, that would just take out the politics of abortion from the politics of reproductive justice. And she made this complicated argument, but you will remember that at that time, Operation Rescue was going on, and there were bombs of Planned Parenthood clinics. Doctors were murdered, people were injured, and a lot of feminist organizations were like, I don't care what kind of intellectual you are and how smart you are, like, we don't go out there and say Roe was wrong. And we won't, like, they just wanted nothing to do with her. And I thought that was a really interesting story, and I thought it made the 1990s feminism infinitely more interesting, that there's a real range of views about a lot of things. I hate the, let's make Ruth Bader Ginsburg a puppet, and she now just is, I hate that. I mean, it's just the way that women who are intellectuals are trivialized is I think, a grotesque form of defamation. So I was happy to see that there was this really interesting story about an act of intellectual courage that in some ways cost her.
Please.
I have a short comment and then a question. My comment is that I am a College Board Advanced Placement Workshop leader, and as I read your book, I said this is a perfect book for assignment to talented high school students. So thank you for that. My question relates to the book I believe you're working on, or maybe it's been produced already. It has to do with teaching people civics.
Oh, yeah.
I'm really interested in that subject, how you got interested in it and where it is coming along.
Yeah, thanks. So thanks for the comment about these truths. I really am hoping that the paperback will be very affordable. I really am hoping that people adopt the book. It's written with a scope that is aimed to do that work. Norton is also preparing a collegiate textbook edition, which will be different too. So the question was about the book that I'm writing. It's done. It's coming out in a couple weeks. It's like this big. It's like one of those things that you get at an airport stall, and you read it before your plane even shows up, which isn't maybe saying too much, but it's like it's called This America, the Case for the Nation, and it's not exactly about how to teach civics. What it is so Foreign Affairs magazine was going to be producing a special issue on nationalism, because nationalism is on the rise around the world, and they asked me to write an essay about American nationalism. And so I did, and then my publisher asked me if I would make it a little bit bigger, a longer meditation on nationalism. And so it's about what nationalism is and what it isn't, and what the word even means, which I think people don't have any idea. Nationalism has a really complicated history, and we tend to mean very different things when we use the term. So it pulls all those things apart. But basically, it argues that there was it begins with this story. Sorry, everything will be a story. One of my favorite historians, Carl Degler, gave a presidential address to, I think it was the American Historical Association in 1983, maybe, in which he said, it turns out that when you look around, like the program guide of the AHA, or you read books that historians who are in academic history departments, no one's writing national history anymore. Because people think that national history helped create nationalism, like the monster of nationalism that ravaged the West in the 1930s and 1940s, like the nationalism of fascism, the nationalism of Nazism, and that was behind liberal academic historians' understanding of American atrocities in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. That to write a national history was to engage in the propping up of these national myths for the purpose of essentially justifying national acts of violence. And so, for that reason and many others, American historians had stopped writing national history. And Degler, and also people were like, "Oh, everything's global now. It's it's the '80s. Like we have global trade and global commerce, global communication, global transportation. Like the nation state is about to die." And a lot of people said that. That 1989 Francis Fukuyama essay, "The End of History," was about how the nation state was dead. The nationalism was dead too, because everything was global and everything was liberal. And Degler said at this address, he said, if we don't write national history because we think their nation states won't be around that much longer, by which we mean like a half century, people will still in all those years be living in nation states, and they will want stories to explain their political communities. And if we don't write those stories, write national histories, then a bunch of frauds and charlatans and tyrants and demagogues are going to offer up those histories. And then we will have a resurgence of nationalism. And it was a very terrifying warning. He just gave this kind of warning to the historical community, and nobody listened. So my essay is a kind of like, he was right. Like that's in fact what happened. That people who live in nations, and so the reason the book is called The Case for the Nation, it's an argument against nationalism, but it's an argument for the nation state. I mean, the nation state, the liberal nation state, which is a creation of the late 18th and 19th century, was devised in the West to invent the category of citizens who are people whose rights can be protected by constitutions. Like, we don't have some other mechanism for having rights and being citizens than nation states. And until we do, we need to have nation states. They're the only things that can guarantee rights as an institution. So it's an argument about what the nation is and why we should care about nations, and why it's actually even okay to love your country, which is a controversial thing to say in certain circles, and a very uncontroversial thing to say in other circles. But so it's a discussion of what a nation is and how that's different from caring about a nation as a political community is different from the claims of nationalism. It wasn't really a big sell for that book. You guys I'm not reading that. But I promise you. Okay, thank you. You will. It's a light and entertaining read. It passes the Subway test.
Great presentation, great discussion. Thank you. My question also concerns nationalism and sovereignty. I share the hope we probably all share that we can solve Trump and healthcare nationally. But I think we might also all agree that no single nation is responsible for the melting of Antarctica. And global warming is, my question is, can issues, problems, challenges with the scale of global warming be dealt with by a sovereign nation or any collection of them?
Well, let me ask you, what's the other choice than a collection of sovereign nations for
addressing that? It's United Nations, and there's also panic. An extraterrestrial, global warming could be analogous to an interterrestrial enemy. Interplanetary.
Extraterrestrial? Is that what you're looking at?
Yeah.
Wait, I don't get that. In what sense?
Well, it would unify the country.
I see.
It would bring nations together.
I see. Yeah.
Common cause.
Yeah.
Think Sputnik. Sputnik brought a lot of people together.
Sputnik destroyed the teaching of American history, so I don't want to think about Sputnik. Yeah. Okay, no, thank you for the question. the implication of your question is it requires international cooperation to address not just this one problem, but other problems as well. Problems involving, the challenges of immigration and trade barriers. This is what treaties are for. But again, like nation states engage in those treaties. Like you need sovereign actors to engage in those treaties. Do I think? I guess I don't know. There's not. I think I've answered the question that you raised, but I actually think there is we're on the edge of an awful lot of political movement around those issues. I think even just in the last 18 months, a number of people who were, for a variety of reasons, skeptical of even that something was going on are significantly less skeptical and slightly more terrified. And so I do think there's quite a bit of movement there. But I think there's a movement politically across a political spectrum. But where the national leadership in this country comes from is a big question.
Years and years ago, I saw a Jay Leno program where he would ask people on the street general questions. And one of them I remember, I still wake up screaming when I think about, was at the UCLA graduation. He was talking to the students in their caps and gowns, and he would ask questions like, which side won the Civil War? And things like that, and no clue. And it occurred to me, what have they learned? And then combine that with, if you look at a lot of C-SPAN programs of events like this, and you kind of scan the heads, the demographics of these crowds are almost always...
This is a vigorous crowd.
I'm very vigorous.
What did Trump say the other day? Trump said, I am a young man.
Let's just say there's a lot of baldness and there's a lot of gray hair. And as a teacher of younger people, what is your opinion of how America in general has an interest in history or even considers history when they think about politics?
Oh, we'll go back to Sputnik, and I'll now blame Sputnik.
Yeah.
Or the young people. I mean, I'm sure people who take your class are very motivated, but what is your opinion in general, if you have one, of under 40 people in this country?
So there's where I don't blame those UCLA students. I blame the faculty. I just don't get the, I don't know. I certainly don't blame public school teachers. They're working really hard. The historical profession, I think, bears a lot of responsibility for what was for many decades a kind of contempt for public engagement, right? Like the role that you have, Jim, here in terms of establishing and strengthening public engagement with the materials in this collection, with the scholars who come to visit. That role wasn't always part of the mission of this institution. I suspect it was at the founding for many decades, and then it fell away. There's a kind of mid-20th century intellectual disdain for the people, right, that is pretty well documented and contributes to the rise of the conservative movement. And so there's a lot to take responsibility for. And when people complain about the state of the world, my go-to thing is tell me exactly how you have contributed to the bad things that are going on. I'm not going to put you on the spot, but I think if you close your eyes and you think about what crappy thing have I done that actually is making our American political culture a little bit worse, we all have a thing. We all have probably a list. Even if you think you're acting with integrity and you have sound political principles, you doubtless have done something that you've actually kind of made the situation worse. I think that we all have. And so I think it's really important to kind of start with what is my responsibility, not what are the shortcomings of others. We live in such a judgy time. So I'm not implying that you were saying you were being judgy of young people at all, you were being compassionate about public discourse. But I think it's really important. I think my students are deeply interested in historical problems, but they wouldn't label them that. They wouldn't say they're interested in history. Although everything that they are interested in, they are interested in for historical reasons, in the sense that they see themselves at a particular moment in time that is a kind of particular crisis that is the consequence of a certain set of acts that preceded them. But we don't think about that as history because we think history is what's on the History Channel, and it's the latest thing that somebody says on CNN, about how FDR once said, blah, blah, we just such a crap public version of history. Instead of a version of history that is about inquiry, and about humility, and about curiosity, and about empiricism. So where does that happen, and how do we cultivate that? I mean, I guess I would say, like, this is a particular sort of audience, but, like, when I go to other places that are other kinds of institutions or in other neighborhoods in different cities, like, I talk to different people. Like, I talked to a high school today. Like, we're just all here maybe for a shared set of reasons this evening in this place. But the reason I go do all these things all the time is because I think it's really important to talk to a lot of people. So I guess the thing that discourages me maybe about your question is, I do think there's been a huge consequence of the cultural celebration of STEM and the desperation with which educators believe it is necessary to fund and promote STEM. There was recently a discussion, maybe it was in the state of Florida, of dropping all the foreign language requirements in the high school because you could substitute computer language instead. And it's just like, they already don't have arts and music. Like, couldn't you substitute a computer language for a math requirement? Like, it's mathematical thinking. Like, it doesn't substitute for a humanistic body of knowledge, which is the acquisition of a language of another culture, which teaches you about language. Computer language is metaphorically a language. It's hugely important. Like, I have no problem with people learning computer language in high school. But why take out, like, one of the few things that's left that actually teaches people about the true diversity of humankind, you know? So and that is my, like, the long trail of Sputnik. It's still orbiting around. Sputnik's still up there going, beep, 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 beep. Only study math and science. Only study math and science. Get jobs. Get jobs. There needs to be a place where we say, welcome to humankind. Read W.E.B. Du Bois. Like, learn Swahili. Read Shakespeare, perform on the cello, learn African dance. Like, these things are part of who we are as humans, and we have demoted them for so many decades and deprived them of proper funding. We treat people who work in those fields as lesser than people who work in engineering and especially computer science field. I'm married to a computer scientist, so none of this is personal. But I think there's a real cost, like, when you look around and you see what people tolerate as explanations of what the country is. I mean, Make America Great Again is a 4-word historical argument. You would like people to have better arguments. Yes.
Here?
Some of us here knew your mother, and my first exposure to your writing was the...
Don't ask me about my mother, I will cry. No, go ahead, I'm sorry.
But you told a wonderful story in that testimony, and I think that for this audience it would shed light on how you became part of how you became. And it's the story of the blueberry bushes.
Oh, yeah. Should I not tell this? My sisters and my brother are here. So is it okay if I tell this story? My mother, Marjorie Lepore, was an amazing woman. She married to an amazing person, my father, Frank Lepore, who some of you may know or read his column. He had a column in the Clinton Daily Item for many years. I wrote an essay for the New Yorker a few years ago about the year that both of our parents died. My father died first, and my mother died within the year. And I can't speak for my siblings, but I kind of thought that it would have been hard to take care of my father in many ways, and that my mother would have this new chapter. And this happens with so many people who have been married for so long. There's a kind of, you can't live without the person anymore. And I told the story about my growing up and about them and about how they met in the context of an essay that was actually about how I came to write a book about Benjamin Franklin's sister Jane. And the reason I wrote the book was I remember one day I would go visit my mother. When I was in graduate school, I was at Yale. I remember one day I went to the library, and I'm sure they're in this room, to look at the volumes, the collected writings of Benjamin Franklin, which are a Yale University Library archival project, and it started in like 1954, and they're still going on, and there's like tens and tens of volumes. And it was like, I was like, this is a fun day in the library. It's like this. It's like a thing like this. And I started with the first volume, which is the first letter that Franklin sends home. Or there's even some essays before that. And it goes all the way, to after his death. And I put them down one by one, and I paged through them and was reading Franklin. Franklin's very funny, so it's fun to read his letters. But like every other letter was to his sister Jane. And I never heard of Jane Franklin. And it made me so mad. Like, she was so interesting. And so I was visiting my mom and sitting around the kitchen table. She's like, how are you doing, honey? What are you studying? And I was like, Mom, I got to tell you this crazy thing. You know Benjamin Franklin? Oh, I know Benjamin Franklin. Because we grew up on Franklin Street. and in West Boylston. And she's like, yeah, Benjamin Franklin. I said, yeah, did you know he had a sister Jane? And she said, no. And so I told her the whole story. And, like you're in graduate school, your parents basically think you're useless. Like, why are you getting this PhD? You're living on beans with like 9 roommates who are vegans. You have a different boyfriend every week. Like, it's a bad scene. And so, like, I always try to reassure my parents that, like, it was good because it was entertaining and I was learning a lot. So I would I told this whole long, crazy story about Jane Franklin and how Benjamin Franklin's life was rags to riches and hers was rags to rags. I mean, she was born in poverty. She never got out of poverty. She had 12 children, and they all died. She married at 50, and she was raped. It's a horrible life. And yet she's so funny in these letters and so interesting. And so I wrote this long essay about Jane Franklin. But it was actually about how my mother said, you have to write a book about her. And how it took me decades to eventually write that book. And by the time I finished it, my mother had died. And it's a great regret of mine. So to the blueberries. When you're trying to get to Jim's question about writing, when you're trying to write about people, a thing that really works is the telling detail. Like if I were introducing, my Uncle Joey, and I said Uncle Joey was born in Cleveland in 1941, and he was drafted in the Vietnam War, but he escaped to Canada, and then he got married there, and he had 4 children, and he was a banker, and he's dead now. You'd be like, whatever. But if I said, my Uncle Joey, when he was living in Canada, he actually, he once met a bear in the woods, and he swears to God that he danced with that bear because there was music playing at his campsite, and the only thing he could think to do was to boogie, and he boogied with that bear, and we used to call him Boogie Bear Joey. Then you'd be like, I want to meet Uncle Joe. Right? So when you're writing, you don't want to give, you want to have the telling detail, the detail that does an extraordinary amount of work. And so for my mom, the detail, which I know is the detail that people remember because I get so many letters about the blueberry bush. I still get, every week, someone writes me about it. So when my parents got married, my dad was a little bit older, and he was the school principal of, the elementary school or middle school in West Boylston, and he hired my mother in August. And every day he would put a poem in her mailbox in the teacher's room, which would not be allowed now, but because the best one, she showed me the poems once, because she kept them all. The best one was, Marjorie, let me park my car in your garagery. So, anyway, my dad was hilarious. So, he hired her in August, and he was like, I'm going to marry this woman by the end of the year, and they married in June. This is in 1955 they met, and they married in 56. But they really didn't know each other all that well, except through work. And my dad had been living with his mother, and he was, I think, 35 when they married. And so he was used to being very well taken care of. Let me just... I think we all know what that means. So they go to Maine for the wedding. I'm sorry, this is a long story, but you'll see at the end of it, you'll feel like you know my mother. They go to Maine for the wedding to this log cabin, and it's like their first night. Right? They get there at night, they sleep, they get up in the morning. This is a long time ago. This is a very different experience of your first night of wedded life. And my mother gets up early, and she has brought all this stuff. My mother hated to cook, but she makes blueberry pancakes. And she would always tell me this story. This was like, you need to know this story. So she serves them the blueberry pancakes, and my father looks at them, and he pushes back his plates, and he says, I don't like blueberries. So 2 things. 1, my mother never made breakfast for my father again in over 50 years of marriage. And 2, the first thing she did when they bought a house was plant a blueberry bush in the backyard. My brother still has the blueberry bush because it was just symbolic of just just don't. I just don't. That was my mom.
So you mentioned briefly the difference between evidentiary and ideological disagreement. So I have sort of three questions about that, which you can answer all of, one of, two of. The first is, do you think there is a very clear difference between the two, or do they run together? The second is, which do you think is more prominent right now, or are they equally prominent? And the third is, do you think one is more important than the other in general or right now?
Okay, I'll try to answer them as best I can remember them. I think arguments based on evidence are more important because they last longer. There's an evanescence to ideological argument. With regard to your other questions, which I'm now going to have a hard time recalling, I think when you say, are they the same thing, or do they blend together evidentiary arguments and ideological arguments, what I don't believe so, but I take your question to suggest what I think of as the chief way that people talk about a lot of forms of knowledge, especially in schools, especially in high school, which is to play the game that I think of as spot the bias. A lot of how young people are taught to learn is to look at something and figure out how biased it is, and then you can feel superior to it. You can feel triumphant over your textbook because your textbook is biased. You can feel triumphant over what you're learning in your psychology class because it turns out social psychology is all biased and the evidence is all crap. That we actually, as a mode of instruction, prioritize teaching teaching young people how not to know something because we are so determined to excavate and reveal the ideological bias of everything around us. And while that is important, it's important to understand ideological positions from which people write and do research. It completely devalues our capacity to discern something, whether something's true or not. It is a way of teaching how not to know. So is it possible to rid yourself of your own subject position when doing any kind of work in any field? No. We live as human subjects with particular positions. Do I believe that teaching people about proper methods of investigation, we value the scientific method for real reasons. I value a historical method for real reasons. I absolutely believe that, and I can think of a lot of instances in my own work where I brought to the research on something that I really understood as a bias of my own, where I knew I was quite short-sighted about something and I felt kind of fierce about it. And I really struggled with relieving myself of that and looking at the evidence afresh and changed my mind. I was on this great panel at the law school recently called Why I Changed My Mind, which I thought was a fantastic idea for a forum, to just bring a bunch of interesting people to tell a story about why they changed their mind about something. And it was a really interesting exercise because it gives you a lot of faith in our capacity to discern what's true and what's not true when you hear people explain what it was. Because usually it's having an argument with somebody, but sometimes it's encountering new evidence. So thanks. Did you want to come up?
Thank you. So I was wondering, as a reporter, what are your kind of thoughts on the emerging use of the internet so people can become experts at a thing kind of at a touch of a finger, while at the same time you have kind of the proliferation of groups that are kind of so insular on the internet, and how that affects people's perceptions of history and fake news and such like that?
Oh, so we saved the easy question for the... That's a really hard question. I can give you a bunch of observations about that. So the democratization of knowledge is fundamentally an Enlightenment project. Institutions like this, or the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia that were founded, in the 18th and early 19th century, their commitment was to the diffusion of knowledge, that this was the promise of the Enlightenment. The 17th and 18th century were about incredible scientific advance and political advance, but the 19th century would be about the diffusion of knowledge and the democratization of knowledge and the incredible rise in literacy rates. And I believe in that Enlightenment project deeply. I think how the kind of opening of the internet, which of course was built by the military, the opening of it to commercial traffic, was pitched was as part of that longer Enlightenment project of diffusing and democratizing knowledge. And that was the whole kind of great, like, the Yahooism of the 90s. It's going to be great. It's going to be great. We're all going to be equal. Everything, all the political problems of the world are going to go away. There'll be no more nation states. There'll be no more inequality. Like, the internet would solve every problem. And it was pretty early on to that fanaticism that people started writing books like The Myth of Digital Democracy. Even before social media, people pointed out that this wasn't actually how this particular technology was working. And it's working less well in that direction now, right? Like, what I think there's a fair, we could talk about this for the next 7 days, but there is certainly significant evidence that this technology of communication has contributed to widening inequality, and especially to new forms of political disenfranchisement, rather than opening up. And it certainly has been detrimental to forms of political community and belonging. No, but you could also say the opposite. Like, people would say, and they would be right, like, Black Lives Matter is a movement that emerged largely through this form of social media and the video capturing of things that were invisible to other people and the broadcasting of that, of instances of police brutality that are broadcast immediately and contribute to a huge social movement for criminal justice reform. That's, obviously just incredibly urgent politically. So there are lots of instances of what scholars call counter-publics. Like, there's a public sphere, but it actually is totally disenfranchised, and so counter-publics work to reform. So you could think about it as a counter-public, and I think there's something meaningful there. That doesn't get to your question about polarization. And one of the things that I argue in these truths, the last chapter is called America Disrupted, and it starts on 9/11 in 2001, and goes to Election Day in 2016, which just happens to be where I had to end the book. And what I talk about in that chapter is that the political polarization that I chronicle in the previous chapter, which is called Battle Lines and runs from 1974 to 2000, so really kind of Nixon's resignation to the Bush v. Gore contested election. Think about that quarter century. What I argue there in the penultimate chapter is that party hacks and political consultants realigned the two parties deliberately during those years through particular use of constitutionally weak, emotionally volatile issues, and in particular, too, guns and abortion. So I sometimes describe it this way. If you think of a grid where you can divide it into 4 quadrants, and on the x-axis you can put guns and abortion, and on the y-axis you put murder and freedom. So if you're a liberal in this invented polarity that's invented by political manipulators in the 70s and 80s and 90s, if you're a liberal under this rubric, guns are murder and abortion is freedom, and if you're a conservative, guns are freedom and abortion is murder, and you can get people to vote that way. In other words, like, those issues are so emotionally volatile, you can create political urgency around them because they're all about life and death. They're outside the realm of ordinary politics, which is not actually about life and death. It's about decisions that require compromise. Life and death question you cannot compromise on if you believe about those things about murder and freedom. So you erect this polarized politics in that era, and in the final chapter of the book, which is America Disrupted, is about how that polarization, which was done by hand, by telephone calls and direct mail and people standing outside the precinct, that actually has been all automated. It's a fully automated polarizing machine. It's impossible unless you stop the machine to get out of that. And that's what I have a lot of political despair about the role of that form of communication technology in our political arrangements, because I think many people want to break out of that divide, and it's almost technologically impossible.
I want to announce that the game has started and the Red Sox are not yet losing. So, according to the internet.
Okay.